Why are organisms the way that they are? And how did they get to be that way? A biologist's answer to that question is the theory of evolution by natural selection. And as with every theory, this theory has two components: a pattern observed in nature and a proposed mechanism that explains that pattern. And so the pattern here is actually the evolution part. We know that populations of organisms change over time. We see this over very long time scales, for example, in the fossil record, but we also see it over very short time scales in organisms that reproduce much more rapidly. For example, if I take some bacteria and I put them in some broth and I walk away for a week, the characteristics of what is growing in that broth are going to be very different a week later than potentially the organisms that I put in there to begin with. And so we see this over and over again. That's our pattern. How does this happen? Well, the mechanism part is natural selection. And what we mean by natural selection is that certain traits are selected over others. And so for selection of traits to lead to evolution, two things must be true. First, those traits must be heritable. If an organism has a trait, has some sort of characteristic, then it must have some mechanism to pass that trait on to its progeny. And the second is that those traits must impact that organism's survival or its likelihood to reproduce, which is to say that organisms that have the trait must do a better job producing offspring than organisms that don't. And so if an organism has a trait that makes it more likely to produce offspring, we call that trait an adaptation. And we say that organisms that have that adaptation are more fit than organisms that don't, which is to say that they're more likely to survive and they're more likely to reproduce. And if organisms with an adaptation are making more progeny, and those progeny also have that trait, then what's going to happen to that trait, right? If you look at the entire population, those organisms are going to be more likely to have this adaptation because organisms with that adaptation are more likely to produce progeny that also inherit it. And so I'm going to talk about, for the next minute or two, one of the most famous examples of this happening over the course of the last couple of 100 years or so. And that is with some rather famous English moths. And so prior to the Industrial Revolution, these English moths like to hide out on birch trees, mottled speckled birch trees, and mostly they're kind of white, right? Because a birch bark is white, and that makes the moth hard to see, unlikely to get eaten, and that coloration is a heritable trait. And so moths that were black, for example, occasionally show up, but that's actually a maladaptation. Those moths are much more likely to get eaten because they're easier to see against this mottled white birch bark. However, then the Industrial Revolution comes along, and all of a sudden everybody is burning coal to run factories, to heat their homes, and that coal dust turns the birch trees black. Now, given a white moth and a black moth, which of those moths do you think is more likely to get eaten by a hungry bird? All right, now instead of white being an adaptation which increases the moth's fitness, black is that adaptation. And so now the black moths are more likely to reproduce and make black babies. And so how does the population change? Okay, once the trees have gone from white to black, the moth population also goes from primarily white to primarily black. And this is a really key point. Fitness depends on the environment. Okay, and actually the moth story illustrates this really beautifully, because now let's say it's the 1970s. Okay, that's about when the EPA came into existence in the United States. And now there's a lot less coal dust in the air, and that coal dust isn't sticking to trees, and now those birch trees are white again. Now which of these two moths is more fit? And what do you think happened to the moth population at that point? This is an example of evolution by natural selection, right? The population is changing, it's evolving. This is the pattern that we see over and over and over in nature. And the mechanism by which this occurs is natural selection, where traits that are heritable traits impact the survival and the reproduction of the organism, and organisms that have that trait become more fit, are more likely to reproduce, are more likely to transmit those traits onto their children, and this leads the entire population to evolve.